Hi everyone, this is Dylan Wilkes. I'm the CTO with Orange Photonics, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about our latest release of our LightLab analyzer, which is the LightLab 3 law enforcement version. So thank you very much for spending some time with us today. And if you do have questions, feel free to enter them in on the lower right-hand part of your screen there. And my colleague Ashley is going to be able to try to answer as many of those as we can once we finish up here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation, and let's get going here. Okay, so I'm going to go over a few things, and to begin with, I just wanted to give you a quick agenda to show you what we're going to walk over. The first thing we're going to do, of course, is just talk about the LightLab 3 Law Enforcement Edition and what it really is. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about how the device is used. And then we'll get into some of the details about what can be done with the LightLab 3 and some of the performance characteristics, that kind of thing. And then finally, I'm going to go through a couple real-world scenarios where LightLab 3 would be run in particular by law enforcement. So let's go ahead and just get started. So first thing I want to go over is what actually is the LightLab. And many people call it the orange box. So inside this box, there's what's called an HPLC. So basically, this is a portable HPLC or high performance liquid chromatograph. And really what we're doing is measuring cannabinoids, which is the potency. And for those of you that are not that familiar with cannabis, there's really two major ones that we're going to be talking about a lot today. And that is THC, or delta-9 THC, which is the psychoactive form of psychoactive cannabinoid that's mostly of interest. And then CBD, which is the hemp-derived or non-psychoactive cannabinoid that's often present in cannabis samples. And the fact that this is an HPLC is kind of important since this is the preferred method by the USDA for measuring hemp for compliance. And it's also generally what probably 99% of both public and private labs use to analyze cannabinoids within cannabis products. So what we've really done is we've taken that HPLC technology and we've shrunk it down into a box that's both ruggedized and portable. And we've also simplified the operation so that it can be used in the field with minimal training. This is actually our third generation of the machine, so we've got some really interesting capabilities that this device can go through, and I'll kind of touch on a few of those today. So next thing I just want to talk about is what actually can it measure. So we're talking about measuring cannabinoids, but in what products? The ones shown here are the typical things that we can measure, although there can be others as well. Plant and flower are the most common. That can be either wet or dry. So wet meaning cut directly from a field, and dry meaning kind of the cured buds that you might see typically with hemp or cannabis buds. In addition, you can measure cannabis concentrates, which can take many forms. We can also measure things like tinctures and edibles. We also have a special mode that allows us to measure hemp compliance. So we can measure THC levels in hemp down to 0.05%, which is significantly lower than the 0.3% legal limit in the United States and in most other places. We can also measure some other things like isolates and young plants, which are typically challenging for field-based analysis. And we do have custom modes as well that allow you to do more complex measurements if needed. So what's going on in the hood with the LightLab? I'm just going to kind of touch on really briefly. Hopefully I won't go too far over anyone's head here. I do have a tendency to do that. But really there's kind of two technologies that are built into LightLab. And the first is called chromatography, and the second is spectroscopy. So I'm going to talk about chromatography a little bit here. Essentially what happens is when you're running a sample with a LightLab, you're going to extract anything into a liquid. So everything's liquid based. It's kind of a liquid solvent. And what's going to happen is that solvent goes through what's called a column, which is shown in the picture there. That column, the cannabinoids that are in your sample, the THC and CBD, for example, have different affinities to that column. So some are going to get stuck inside the column for longer than others. And that means that as they go through the column, it's going to take longer for example, THC to come out before than it does for CBD to come out. So we've effectively separated the different components we're interested in measuring with this technique. And essentially what will happen is once it's completed, different cannabinoids are coming out the bottom at different times. And as a really kind of simplified example of what is going on here on a chemical basis, if you think of a shopping mall, if you really like shoes and there's a shopping mall that's absolutely filled with shoe stores and you walk in one end of that shopping mall, it's going to take you a while to get through because you're going to go in through every single shoe store and check out all the different shoes. But if you're someone who doesn't really like shoes that much, you're going to kind of tread through that mall pretty quickly and be out the other side much faster than that first person. And really the same thing's happening in the column, where the cannabinoids are wanting to interact more or less with the column material and therefore get separated. So once we've separated all the different cannabinoids, the next thing we do is use spectroscopy to measure them. So we're shining UV light through the sample, and that amount of light that's absorbed by the sample is correlated with its concentration. We actually use multiple wavelengths of light to provide some extra confirmation and information about the cannabinoids. And I know this kind of sounds really complicated, and this is the most complicated part of the presentation, I promise. But the one thing I do want to highlight is that the devices and parts that we're using inside LightLab are definitely hardened and ruggedized. In fact, the detector system we're using is actually also used on the Mars Curiosity rover. So it's been through some pretty rough things and still acts nicely. So with that technical stuff out of the way, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the law enforcement stuff some of the law enforcement needs for a field test. So the reason that people use LightLab generally as law enforcement is to tell whether something is hemp, which is predominantly CBD, or marijuana or drug type cannabis, which is THC, a high THC sample. So really we're trying to detect whether something is pot or not. And the main problem that law enforcement officers have is oftentimes when they go out in the field and gather evidence, they have to wait for a lab. So having something like a LightLab allows them to not have to wait at all. They can get results right in the field instantly. And that's really important because oftentimes things are changing in fields, or if you leave the field, people can cut it down, or there's a question of who's got access to it and that kind of thing. So really this device allows an officer to do things like execute warrants, help with probable cause cases, and in a lot of cases, district attorneys often require quantitative evidence to pursue a cannabis-related case. So the LightLab allows that to be completed. The other thing to note is the device typically is lower in cost to run, certainly than doing a single lab test. So the cost per test is quite low. And another really important part about doing a field test is it really provides extra legal protection. It's pretty difficult to tell hemp from marijuana or drug type cannabis in the field. Things like drug sniffing dogs have difficulty telling them apart. So having the quantitative results and an ability to be assured that this is a THC sample is really important, and it makes the job easier for the officers. So some of the use cases that we've come across already, although there are probably plenty more, I just want to touch on a few that are kind of give you an idea of how the device could be used. The first one is during hemp shipment. Now that there's hemp legalized in the United States in particular, there's shipments of hemp going around. There could be thousands of pounds of plant biomass being shipped around. And if you were to pull over a driver, it's really difficult to tell whether that product is actually hemp or it could be some illicit substance. So using the LightLab can be a great way to do that quickly without having to have delays of lab reports and that kind of thing. The other thing we've seen a lot of is in unlicensed operations or organized crime operations, where maybe using illegal products or selling illegal products, or even producing illegal products. So having the ability to tell what's allowed and what's not right on the field or right there is really important. And the final thing I just want to highlight is anytime you can't tell hemp from marijuana is a time when the LightLab is really a useful tool. In many cases, you can't tell by visual alone, so having the LightLab provides that extra assurance that, yes, this is what I think it is. So some of the users we have of this device already are police and sheriff's departments, of course, who use it with their drug task force. We have drug enforcement agencies using it, as well as bureaus of investigation that look into larger cannabis-related cases. We have some narcotics laboratories that use the device to reduce their testing load and speed up the testing processes. And then we also have folks that are in transportation and ports of entry, whether that be on the federal side or the state side, looking at border issues and testing products that are coming into their jurisdiction. So I want to go over some of the details of the LightLab at this point. So this basic device is very similar to our current LightLab 3 device that's on the market already. But we've tuned a few things specifically for law enforcement individuals. So for example, the sample types that are present and up front and center are specific to law enforcement. These are things like plants and concentrates and edibles. In addition, the instruction sets are tailored for law enforcement use, so it's easier to use, easier to prepare in the field, given the types of samples that law enforcement folks are expected to see. Another really important thing that the law enforcement version of LightLab offers is 2 different testing modes. So you can either run the device in what we call the presumptive mode, where it gives a determination of whether a sample is high CBD or a non-psychoactive product, or high THC, which would be a psychoactive product. In doing this mode, it's a quite simple sample preparation, so it's a little bit easier to do in the field and provide you that indicator of whether it's essentially hemp or a cannabis product or a marijuana product. In addition, we have the standard quantitative mode that allows you to analyze with lab-grade accuracy up to 11 cannabinoids. And then finally, another thing I wanted to touch on is the data capabilities of the LightLab, especially the law enforcement version. So not only is the C of A that the LightLab generates saved onto a thumb drive on the device, but also things like the raw data and the raw chromatogram that are used, that could be used by expert witnesses or experts in the field to further provide evidence in support of any kind of processes going on within the LightLab. So there is that kind of backup ability to look at raw data and use that in addition for any court cases, et cetera. Let's talk a little bit more about the presumptive mode. So in this mode, as I mentioned before, you're going to be able to determine whether a sample is high THC, which is psychoactive or drug type, or high CBD, which is essentially medicinal or non-psychoactive. Generally, using this mode allows you to have faster and simpler sample preparation, and it actually uses, instead of the percent THC as an indicator, it uses ratios of the different cannabinoids. And that allows us to be accurate not only with regular plant material, but other more difficult samples, such as edibles or young plants, which may have very little cannabinoids total, but we can still use these ratios to determine, yes, this is actually a predominantly THC sample, or yes, this is a predominantly CBD sample. And what you're going to get is the picture on the left there, which is showing a green box for high CBD, or it'll show a red box for high THC. And one note about the presumptive mode, it still does generate that raw chromatographic data for evidence support. Here's a little larger picture of the presumptive mode results screen. As you can see, it's quite simple. You've got in this case, this is a high CBD sample. So on the right, you're going to have your box that's either going to be green or red, depending on the sample type. And in addition, on the left, we're showing the ratio of THC to CBD, which can be an important indicator of whether this is really a THC dominant or CBD dominant sample. In this case, it shows 0 to 1, which means that there is no THC at all in sample. This is a fully CBD sample, and it is generally legal in the US at least. So the other kind of mode that we have is called the quantitative mode, and this allows you to get lab-grade quantitative results. So you're going to get actual numbers for the different THC and CBD levels, as well as up to 11 cannabinoids. The sample prep still is field ready. It's a little bit more involved than just doing the presumptive test, because you've got to weigh a sample, but it's still very easy to do in the field, even by non-technical personnel. And the other thing to note with the quantitative mode is it also provides that presumptive determination as well. So what you're going to see is actually 2 different results screens that you can flip between. The first screen is what we call the summary screen. And in this, you're going to see the THC levels and the CBD levels. And if you're confused by the numbers on there, the one to really look at is the total potential THC and the total potential CBD. Those are generally recommended by the USDA, and most testing labs use those as the marker of how much potency there is of each type of cannabinoid. And then down below, you're getting that presumptive ratio again. In this case, this is a high CBD sample. If you were to hit the details button, you can get into the details of some of the other cannabinoids that are present. In this case, there is a couple other minor cannabinoids present, which might be useful further down the line. So now that we kind of have a rough idea of what the LightLab can do, I wanted to give a couple examples of what LightLab, how LightLab's used in the real world. So I'm going to give a couple scenarios here and kind of walk through them and show you how LightLab would be used within these examples. So the first scenario is a unlicensed farm that might be reported by a neighbor or anyone within the jurisdiction. So in this case, generally, local drug enforcement officers will want to be able to test right on the scene. So they're going to bring their LightLab right there on the scene and be able to test to see if anything nefarious is going on. In this case, this is wet material, and by wet I mean it's directly cut off the field. It hasn't been dried or cured, and it could even be not possibly at the flowering stage of the plant. So generally, the THC, or sorry, the cannabis plant has a vegetative stage and a flowering stage, and at that flowering stage is when most of the cannabinoids are generated. But in this case, even in the case where it's not in flowering, we can still tell whether it's a hemp type sample or a psychoactive sample. And in addition, in this scenario, the DA might recommend or require quantitative evidence in order to move forward with prosecution. And in a lot of cases, there might be organized crime that's known to operate in the area. So being able to test right there and not leave the field and let them cut it down or hide it or further tamper with things is going to be really important here. So when they arrive at the scene, the first thing they're going to do is set up their LightLab. This generally takes about 5 minutes to put it together and run a warm-up. One thing to note is the LightLab is fully battery powered if needed. It can run up to 8 hours on battery power, and everything you need to run it can be run directly from the LightLab. Once you set up the LightLab, the first thing you're going to see is this main screen. You're going to select the sample type. In this case, we're selecting a plant material since that's what's going to be tested. But you can see there are other options depending on the sample type that you're planning on running. Once you selected the plant material, it's going to ask whether this is a dried or cured plant or a wet plant. And as I mentioned before, since this is a cut down from a field, it's going to be a wet plant material. Finally, it's going to ask you whether you want to do that quantitative or presumptive mode that we mentioned previously. And in this case, since the DA was hoping for some quantitative results, we're going to go ahead and use a quantitative mode within the LightLab. So once you select that, the next thing is going to come up is step-by-step instructions that allow you to walk through exactly what's going on within the LightLab and tell you exactly how to prepare your sample. So you don't have to remember or have significant training. Again, this is all designed around non-technical users. So as it walks through it, it's going to walk through all the steps that you need to do. And I'm going to kind of walk through those steps as well with some pictures to show you how a sample is really run. So the first thing you do is weigh out a prescribed amount of sample to the vial. So the LightLab is going to tell you how much sample to put into your vial. And this is anywhere from about 0.3 to 1 grams, depending on the type of sample you've selected. Once you've got that sample weighed, the next thing to do is to add LightLab solvent to the vial. And this is directly pulled from the LightLab sample bottles. And so you add the solvent there. It's typically 30 milliliters or 3 syringes full. So it's just a question of dropping 30 milliliters sample within that vial as well. Next, sorry about that. Next, we place the vial on a shaker that's included with LightLab and powered by the LightLab, and it shakes up the sample for 2 minutes. And what we're actually doing here is a little extraction. So we're taking the plant material, which has cannabinoids in it, and we're pulling the cannabinoids out and into the liquid sample. And we're actually going to analyze that liquid solvent that we've put into the vial. Once you've done the extraction, the next step is to simply inject it with a syringe into the LightLab. It's pretty easy. You just push it through with a syringe and then press the start button. And once you do hit that start button, the device is going to analyze for 8.5 minutes. It's going to sit there and do that separation and detection that we talked about earlier. And when it's completed, you're going to get your results. So in this case, this was definitely a high THC sample. It shows significant levels of THC and also shows no CBD. So there's very little doubt that this is a psychoactive or marijuana type plant and not hemp. If you so desired, you can also look at the details since we did quantitative results, and you can see the other cannabinoids. In this case, there were no other minor cannabinoids present. And again, once you're doing this, the samples are saved on the device, so you're able to look at that thumb drive later that has not only the COA that you're seeing here, but also CSV data about or Excel compatible data that shows the different cannabinoids, and also chromatographic data that can be used by expert witnesses. If you desire, you can at this point actually share by clicking the share button down in the middle bottom of the result there, and share your results by with another individual, either through a cell phone number, or a mobile phone number, or an email. So once you click that share button, you can enter an email or a mobile phone number and send along the results to others. So let's look at another scenario. In this case, a hemp truckload is found at a weigh station, and the driver does have a test report, but for some reason it looks like it could be forged or there's something funny going on. So the problem with this situation is if the driver's pulling hemp, everything's perfectly legal and they could be let go. But if you were to make an arrest, then that would stop them, and it would potentially open up to lawsuits and bad press if it was actually hemp that was being hauled. So in this case, being able to test the sample right on site is going to get that driver back on the road in just a few minutes, assuming they're doing everything on the up and up, or if not, then it can be dealt with very quickly. So in this case, we're measuring dried hemp biomass, so we may not even need to quantify in this case, so we're going to use the presumptive mode, and we just want to really be checking to see whether it's actually legal hemp. So again, the first thing we're going to do after we warm up the device is hit that sample type button for plant again, since this is also plant. In this case, it's dried materials that's shown in the picture, so we're going to click that dried plant button. And in this case as well, it's also a presumptive test that we want to do. So we don't care as much about the actual numbers. We just want to show, yeah, this is hemp, or no, this is marijuana or a psychoactive THC sample. So just like before, there's going to be on-screen instructions. And in this case, they're actually going to be showing some visual instructions as to what to do. And generally, it's a little bit easier to run because you're just going to be filling a little bit of the sample into the vial and not worrying about weighing it, as shown in the picture there. So this is what it looks like in my sample that we've prepared that shows the bottom cone of the vial being filled with some plant material. Once you've filled up the vial to the correct amount, you add solvent again, just like we did previously. And once you've got that solvent in there, again, you're going to put it on the shaker and turn it on for 2 minutes. And that 2 minutes is actually dictated by the LightLab, so it'll show on screen and it'll indicate that it's been extracted for long enough. And again, just to be clear here, what we're doing is we're pulling the cannabinoids out of the plant material, out of the sample, and into the liquid so that we can analyze that liquid for the LightLab. So once we've done the extraction, again, we're injecting that sample right into the LightLab and pressing the start button. And once you do that, it's going to analyze, and you're going to come up with a result that looks similar to this. So in this case, this was a high CBD sample. So in fact, because of the ratio of 0 to 1, we can see that there was actually no THC at all detected. So this is definitely a hemp sample, and the driver could be let go and let on his way. If it was the other way around, of course, the driver could be held or arrested or dealt with in whatever manner is required, depending on the situation. So again, in this case, we didn't even have to quantify it. We were able to quickly determine within 10 minutes or so that, yes, this is definitely hemp, and the person's doing nothing illegal, and they can be let on their way. So another thing I want to mention of presumptive, since we just went through a presumptive test, is that there's just different, depending on the type of sample, there will be different indicators as to how to exactly prepare your sample, but they're all quite simple. In this case, if you look at the wet plants picture there, we've got a slightly different amount of sample to add when it's wet. But if you look at something like a concentrate, we actually do things a little bit differently. What we actually recommend for concentrates is that you take a toothpick, which is actually included with LightLab, and you dip it right into the sample, and that whole toothpick can just go right into the vial for extraction and analysis. And what you're seeing in that picture there is actually a vape cartridge that's been opened up, and we've dipped a toothpick in there to about 1/3 of the way, and then we just threw that right into the vial, and you can add some solvent and get your analysis up and running. So again, pretty simple for something like a concentrate even, which is generally a pretty complicated sample in many cases. And then finally, if you look at something like an edible, it's the same exact process. You're dropping in a prescribed amount of the sample. It doesn't have to be perfect. But one thing we do recommend with edibles is that the samples get broken up into small pieces. By doing so, you're allowing a bigger surface area of the sample to be attacked by the solvent. We can really pull those cannabinoids out of the sample and into the solvent that we're going to use to measure. So generally, in any case, with the presumptive testing, you can see it's pretty easy. You're basically just dumping a small amount of sample in and then adding solvent, and you're off and running. So just to sum things up, basically LightLab is a portable and simple to operate. Sorry, it's portable, simple to operate, and rugged. Yet it still contains that lab-grade accuracy of an HPLC. We also are able to measure both in presumptive and quantitative tests, depending on the situation. So there's some flexibility there. And it's faster and certainly more convenient and economical than sending to a forensic lab. There are many cases in cannabis where it's just not possible or feasible to send it to a lab and wait for several months. And really the main thrust of this release of this version of the LightLab is to make the drug officer's job easier, especially in the light of the hemp legalization. So now that hemp is legal, it can be very difficult to tell the difference between hemp and marijuana or drug-type cannabis. If you look at them visually, they can look identical. If you use drug dogs, they can also misrepresent them. And so having a quantitative tool is really going to make a drug officer's job easier and much simpler for any of these cases where there's some unknowns. And they can do the analysis right on site without having to worry about any kind of waiting for a laboratory analysis or anything like that. So it allows things to happen much more efficiently and smoothly. So that's actually all I had for the talk today. I think we have a few questions, and I'm going to let Ashley take over and ask some of those questions. But please do feel free to get in touch with our sales team if you'd like. We're available, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
All right, our first question is, do you have any comparison data that you use?
Yes, we do. We've actually validated the LightLab in many ways against different types of third-party labs. In addition, the LightLab itself is calibrated with traceable calibration standards. One of the more important ones we have is a proficiency test we just recently did with the University of Kentucky, where they had 78 labs participate. And we all ran a blinded sample, so nobody knew what the results were. Everybody turned them in, and we performed as well, and in many cases better than most laboratories. So that's great validation that the device does exactly do what it says it does, and it can do it accurately. We've also had other groups that have evaluated the device for performance. For example, the Department of Homeland Security has evaluated the device for performance, and we've looked at some other evaluations with third-party labs as well. So we have quite a bit of data, and happy to share that with anybody if they'd like to reach out to have more detail around that.
Another question, is training required to operate the LightLab?
Training is not necessarily required. We do recommend a training session, especially so that the folks that are using it are familiar with the device and its operation. But the short answer is the device is so simple to operate that it is possible to follow the on-screen instructions with almost no training. So it's more of a recommendation just from the point of view of best practices and understanding what's going on and what mistakes can be made and that kind of thing. So we do recommend a training, but it's not by any means required to start using LightLab.
What kind of support is available?
That's a great question. We have a really awesome support team that is dedicated to working with the LightLab. So we have 3 folks that are full-time working on it, and they're available generally 9 to 5 Eastern time, although after hours can also be set up as needed. And generally our response time is either immediate or within a few hours. So we try really hard to allow support to be present where it's needed. We understand that folks are going to be in the field and they need to have data right away. And so we do have a really good support team. And one other note I wanted to mention while we're talking about support is that the device can be connected to the internet, which allows you to review data and as well as share data with the support team, and they can get real-time information about what's going on within your LightLab and make field fixes or adjustments as needed.
Great, and our last question that we'll have time for are the capabilities of the LightLab 3 LE version different from prior models, or is it just the interface?
That's a great question. So LightLab 3, the LE version, does have a few extra things like those presumptive tests, but generally the performance and operation is quite similar to our current LightLab 3 analyzer. So we can measure up to 11 cannabinoids, just like we can with our current LightLab 3, and generally the same hardware is used. It is significantly different than our older version, which we called LightLab 2, in that it has significantly more capabilities and more accuracy. So the LightLab 3 law enforcement version is essentially has just a software interface that's quite different and tailored to the law enforcement individuals.
Great, thank you, Dylan.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. Please feel free to reach out with us if any other questions come up, or if you'd like more information. I'm happy to answer them. So thanks again for spending your time with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.